Morning, everyone, and welcome back to another We Are Sunderland morning brief. And today I'm joined by the wonderful Kieron Brady. How are you doing, mate?
I'm very well. Just about recovered from the woes of the weekend on Wearside and looking forward to the trip to Ipswich on Saturday tea time.
Yeah, spot on. We Are Sunderland will be there. We're covering all the home and away games. As you know, our new site's just launched. We'll be bringing you all the tactical analysis, exclusive interviews, and interviews from former players, as yourself, Mr. Kieron Brady. You can subscribe for £1 for just 6 months. You've been writing a column for us. How have you found that?
I've enjoyed it. Writing about a whole host of subjects is something I've done now for a number of years. So writing about something I've got great passion and experience in doesn't present any major challenges. I think the only difficulty I've found is trying to restrict the word count. But with it being Sunderland Football Club and covering everything that is relevant to them, then there doesn't seem to be any shortage of subject matter.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, we'll touch a little bit on last week, and then we'll move it forward. I mean, you've obviously done a column for us this week, and without divulging too much into that, otherwise, it'll deter people from reading it. But where do you think it went wrong against Newcastle?
Well, I think if you look back over the game, and I would be sympathetic to Sunderland fans who would be disinclined from doing so, it almost seemed evident from the outset that Newcastle took great hold in a psychological sense, in a controlling sense, and the demeanour, the body language of the Sunderland players gradually deteriorated. And I think what Newcastle were very adept at doing was taking the derby out of the occasion, taking the atmosphere from the stadium. And to that end, what you're left with at times is just a whittling down of a football match. And more often than not, the quality that exists within one side over another will come to the fore. And I think the Sunderland fans that I spoke with in the lead up to the game were pragmatic enough to acknowledge that they may lose. But I think what compounds the disappointment of defeat in a derby is when your team don't perform and don't show anything like they've been showing at times throughout the season. So I think from the opening salvos, it was very, very clear who the Premier League team were and, who's the team that's aspirational about getting there.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of Sunderland fans as well after the game. The one disappointment is that they felt that they didn't lay a glove on Newcastle, and then you see the likes of Borough do it, Bristol City at West Ham, I think it was. Do you think there'll be regrets from the players, or I know, because like you've said there, I know leading up to the tie, it was one of those. People viewed it as a free hit. I know internally they didn't, but do you think there'll be any regrets just on, how the game went?
I think individually, players, for example, Jack Clarke, might feel disappointed that on a bigger stage against a Premier League side, he wasn't able to put forward the type of display, the impressive numbers that have been so evident throughout the course of the season. I think in a managerial context, it just continues the probationary period that Michail Beale is currently in regarding the trust, faith and confidence of the wider support. So there will undoubtedly be regrets, but I think that might revolve more around the performance rather than the actual outcome. It was 3-0 on the day. I don't really think that the level of control and possession that Newcastle had necessarily reflected that. It was, people tend to use the boxing analogy that if it was based around control and possession and the assurance within both, it might have been stopped before we got to the hour mark. But there will be disappointment, there will be regrets, but you would like to think they'll be all the better for the experience. And in the last year or so, that's 3 games now against Premier League opposition, insofar as 2 FA Cup games against Fulham and obviously 1 against Newcastle. And I think what it demonstrates is the difference in quality and the likelihood that you'll be punished for any mistakes that you make.
Yeah, one thing that I particularly noticed was just the midfield three. I thought the midfield three in the Championship, they're right up there, but they just didn't get that time to play. If there was a loose ball going to feet, they're able to recover in the Championship, especially with the high press of Newcastle. They weren't able to do that on the day. You were obviously at the club for the 1990 playoff and experienced that, being in and around the environment after a disappointing defeat. What are the feelings in and around like a dressing room, and how do you pick yourself up after moments like that? How would Sunderland players at the minute go about picking themselves up?
Well, I think particularly for a squad that is full of younger players, then it's incumbent upon the management, the coaching staff, to try to make sure that it doesn't have any implications insofar as derailing what the main objective of the season is, for me certainly. And that would be to try to make sure that promotion is attained come May. And whether it was against Newcastle last week or not, and regardless of the outcome, there was no doubt that we're entering a difficult period in relation to the league games that are upon us. And yes, Ipswich Town have went through what many people felt would be a difficult period given they've just been promoted. But it will still be a significant undertaking by the time they get to Portman Road on Saturday. But I think in an individual basis, players have got their own ways of finding resolve and fortitude to overcome adversity. And many of them will have done that throughout their individual careers. It will have been part of their own development. So I don't think what unfolded on Saturday will have any medium to long-term repercussions. They're footballers. They lost a football match. It hurt at the time. It may, and I hope it actually hurt a little bit longer than it ordinarily would. But I do think that by the time they take to the field on Saturday, they should be prepared and mentally ready to go back to the bread and butter, as it were.
Yeah, it's interesting, that, isn't it? Because if you look at I've just had a quick glance there at Sunderland's record for this season, and it's something Michael Beale's spoken about in his pre-match and post-match press conferences, that they need to decide what team they want to be, because they've won 12, drawn 4, and lost 10. So when they lose a game, they respond with a win sometimes. But then on the other side, they can't seem to put a run together where they're where they're able to. That's one of the biggest things in the Championship, is putting a run together. And we've seen over the Christmas period that they put 3 games together unbeaten on the bounce, but they need to sort of try and extend that, don't they? Heading into what is a tough period as well. Even if they're able to come away with points from the likes of Ipswich, that's still a decent enough return.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think Sunderland presently run the risk of being described at times as a team that are very good on their day. Now, the problem with a phraseology such as a player or a team being good on their day is that when you dissect it and read between the lines, what you're essentially saying is that they are inconsistent. And I think if you can take 1 point from 9 against Plymouth, Huddersfield and Millwall, and then take 6 from 6 against West Brom and Leeds, it illustrates that perfectly. And, on the one hand, you might be able to argue that the players are good enough to compete against the very best in what the Championship has to offer. But the annoyance that would come from it is that if they're letting standards slip, which has been something that has been endemic almost in Sunderland Football Club from when I was there, that that's obviously going to be something that grates at the players, of course, but also at the coaches, the management, and naturally the support. So it's a difficult task that Michael Beale has ahead of him. I don't think that he has taken the reins in what might be thought of as normal circumstances, where you come to a club having replaced a manager who has been dismissed or parted company with the club because of continuously poor results, he, in many respects, I would like to think, doesn't change too much, but of course can put his own imprint on where he sees areas that can be improved upon, and has the single focus now, which should be quite organic, in trying to secure promotion back to the Premier League.
What have you made of Michael Beale so far? Because I think, he's, like you've said there, he's come in a really difficult time. Not many clubs part ways with a manager when they're just outside of the playoffs. And I think the consensus from people who I have been speaking to is that, he does need to be given an opportunity. Do you think the stuff in the build-up to Newcastle has hurt him? Obviously, there was handing over part of the home end, the whole Black Cats bar debacle. Do you think that's put maybe an added pressure on him?
I don't believe so. In fact, if anything, I would say that the sideshow that emerged in the days leading up to it, and which will reverberate for some time, can at least allow him to focus exclusively on what his remit is. And if you ask anyone, I think if there's some sort of scenario playing out, nobody would want to be the villain in an exclusive sense. So the debacle that unfolded in the days leading up to it, and the fact that the owner or primary financial figure, Kyril Louis-Dreyfus, was prepared to acknowledge responsibility for it, at least I think to an extent allows Michael Beale to carry on with what he's been tasked to do. But nevertheless, I still think, even for that calamitous episode being put to one side, Michael Beale still has to convince a lot of the supporters that he's the man for the job, that the appointment was made coming from a position of genuine ambition, rather than simply looking for who is the best modern archetypal manager out there that just so happens to be out of work. So he may have a lot to prove still, regardless of what unfolded in the 48 to 70 hours prior to kick-off last Saturday.
I mean, what have you made of the game so far? I mean, aside from the Coventry result, Rotherham away, different type of game, but that's the nature of the Championship, isn't it? What have you made of him and his approach? I know he hasn't said that they've changed too much, but yeah, what have you made of him?
Well, regarding what I'd said a few moments ago, I think he is very much one of this new breed of managers whose playing career would have been relatively low profile, but have gone through all of the qualifications that they can. The one thing I would add about Michael Beale is that he deserves a lot of credit for the amount of work that he has engaged in with regards to his own personal development as a coach. He's not had any reservations about going to different parts of the world to try and learn the wisdom of experienced figures and how they might do things within different football clubs, countries and cultures. So to that end, there's a lot that is commendable. I think where the problem may arise is that when results or performances are not going well, there isn't any way that you can attempt to sugarcoat what we witnessed last Saturday. Not so much the result, the fact that they lost a match, but certainly the performance. And I would like to think he'll come to terms quite quickly with some of the issues that have plagued the club for such a long time, and he will set about trying to address them. And I mean, I would say at the moment, the proverbial report card from the broad support, even those in media and perhaps ex-players, would be that the jury is still out, and things could be better.
That's the thing, isn't it? I mean, even looking back at his Rangers tenure, it's only 10 months that he had there, but he does have the highest win percentage ratio of any Rangers manager in history, but it's albeit over a short period of time. It's the same with QPR. We're still yet to see him really in a role for a prolonged period of time. Even then, in the space of 10 months, I think that's particularly difficult for a manager to shape a side or put a blueprint on. Yeah, of course, you can get ideas over, but still, that's not going to be the finished product by any means. And that's in part where Sunderland sort of find themselves as well, having built up from League One. You know, they're not the finished product. We saw them last year finishing the playoffs. They fell short. It's an interesting time, isn't it? I think even towards the end of this season, just to see how things play out. I mean, I don't know what your take on where Sunderland currently are.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to admire about, you know, what has happened at the club over the course of the last 18 months or so. And I think the decision to adopt a policy that is very much based on youth could be seen as a risk, but I think you can argue strongly that it at least partly has been vindicated. If you're a promoted club and you manage to secure a playoff position in the year that you've just been promoted, I mean, I think it's very difficult to be begrudging about that. All that said, the policy to bring in youth in such huge numbers, I believe, has a financial element to it as well. And the players that have been brought in will not be amongst the better paid players in the Championship. I would find that hard to believe. You know, there might be 1, 2, possibly 3 who are on a significant sum. Now, I think in trying to consolidate a position in the Championship, that's increasingly acceptable. But of course, there is going to come a point where there's much greater expectation and greater demands from the support that, having consolidated a Championship position, which they have now, there's irrefutable evidence that that's what they've done. They should now be trying their utmost to get to the Premier League. Now, the more forgiving, the more patient, the more pragmatic of supporters might make allowances for this season and accept that, well, we might not even get to the playoffs this season because it will be difficult. There's such a number of teams vying for those spots. But certainly, if we're not going to witness it in this transfer window, then in the summer, something is going to have to change in terms of the expenditure, in terms of creating the impression within the wide support that this is it. We are now going to make a genuine, sustainable, financially driven attempt to get promoted back to the Premier League. And then, of course, sorry, carry on.
Do you think a lot of that depends on selling players? Because at the minute, although they've set the stall out early and said, look, this is the type of model we're going to do. We're going to sell younger players, improve them. We've only really seen Ross Stewart's departure, haven't we? We haven't seen any of these younger players sold for money yet. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the advantages, certainly if that is partly, you know, within this policy of bringing in youth, making them better and hopefully selling them on. I mean, in the first instance, I would be disappointed if that's Sunderland's policy and this is the process they're trying to pursue. I would be disappointed if they're trying to make that the most prominent part of bringing in young players. Whether you bring in young players halfway through a career or more experienced and older players, Sunderland Football Club presently are in the Championship. They should not be there. The primary objective should be to not only get promoted, but to try to create some form of acceptable level of performance, whether it's in training and matches, that means you could almost take for granted that you can secure your Premier League position. Now, Sunderland shouldn't be prepared in any way, shape or form to be just half making a fist of it in the Championship. Now, of course, they've just been promoted 18 months ago and it might take some time to adjust given the turnover of players. But the players who come into the club, the players who play on a regular basis, you shouldn't really be under any illusions as to what the primary objective is. And of course, along the way, it may be that a player here, a player there is sold. And of course, Ross Stewart's contract was running down, but to sell him to a division rival who already had Che Adams and Adam Armstrong as experienced forwards, I think tells you a little bit about the primary consideration around the notion of promotion. And I think you can say that and feel it's valid, even although Ross Stewart, of course, hasn't yet played to any meaningful degree at Southampton, and it might be next season before that happens. So I've got my reservations. I think there's a lot to admire, but I would still be undecided in many respects as to whether this policy is going to bear fruit in a whole host of areas.
Yeah, I think that's a sentiment that's echoed by a lot of Sunderland supporters as well, though, isn't it? Because, there's a lot of debate, and always will be debate about Ross Stewart. You can't predict an injury that he's going to get, even when he's only played a handful of championship games when you look back to at the start of, was it last season? But still, I've watched enough of Ross Stewart to know that he'll score goals at whatever level he's at. And so from those early few months that at championship level, he will score goals. Again, I don't think many Sunderland supporters will disagree with you on the sense of, they shouldn't just aim to, to sell the better players to be sustainable and then go to the Premier League. But I think one player who's getting a lot of chatter about him at the minute is Jack Clarke. I mean, do you think he'll move on in January, or do you think they'll look to wait at least until the summer? Because we've saw from, just the loss of a player, like the loss of Ellis Sims, it didn't derail them last year, but they ended up with just, Ross Stewart in the central striker role. I mean, you don't want the loss of a key player like that to derail a season.
It would be absolute. I mean, if you think the debacle prior to the game against Newcastle created such ructions within the support, then selling Jack Clarke in this window would potentially, and I would argue should, create a level of angst and anger among the support that is incalculable. He has been the person that has been the difference in so many games over the course of the season. Now, it didn't materialise for him last week. Kieran Trippier looked back to somewhere near his best. And if you recall, in the opening period of the match, there was a couple of occasions when Almiron and Trippier teamed up down the right. And the body language then of Jack Clarke was, am I going to have to be doing this for 90 minutes today, like chasing back to track down Trippier? And I think that in many respects set the tone for what followed. But that aside, Jack Clarke has shown over the course of this season, he also showed it against Fulham in both FA Cup ties around about a year ago, that when you possess that quality, when your mental approach is as it should be, then I've got absolutely no doubt that he could equip himself at a much higher level. And in the absence of a centre forward who's established, experienced, with proven scoring prowess, then that responsibility in many respects has been taken up by Jack Clarke. And if Sunderland were of a mind to sell him, even if it was for 10 million or more, then all that would succeed in doing, certainly for me, is vindicating the position that I and I dare say others have had with regards to the departure of Ross Stewart, and who knows who else could be in the summer. It's one thing to sell good players, and Sunderland do have good players, but if you don't have to have access to the most in-depth data analysis, and you don't have to be an expert on modern technology to know that Jack Clarke is a huge difference maker for Sunderland in matches. You know, he's not just a good player, he's the person that can distinguish at times between you leaving with no points and 1 point, or 1 point and 3 points. You know, Hull City's the next home game. We only have to go back to the away fixture on Humberside several weeks ago to realise that. So the idea of selling him at this window is preposterous.
Yeah, I certainly think when you look back to the start of last season, all right, Amad Diallo came in off the back of a disappointing Rangers stint, but he became one of the best signings of the Championship last season.
Yeah,
it should, in theory, this window be about adding to the quality that they've got, shouldn't it? Because you don't want to end a window in a weaker position, particularly when you're in the playoffs. And you've seen the likes of Hull City just this week. They've lost. What was it, I think they lost, and then they've strengthened it by bringing in Fabio Carvalho, who Champions League football. I'm not saying that Sunderland can, you know, again, you don't know what wages they're contributing to the parent club and things like that, but they need to try and bring in at least a little bit of blockbuster and box smart in terms of adding some quality on the other side. I know we've said, or Michael Beale said, you know, we'll make allowances for Jack Clarke, but they do need to alleviate some of the pressure. If not, when he has a poor game, allow someone else to step up to the plate. I mean, where do you think that they should strengthen in particular? I know a lot of people who we've spoken to have said, you know, striker remains the obvious one. Is that something that you agree with?
Absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt, because I think if you're a team that quite often enjoys 65% of play, and you manage to gain significant territorial advantage where the game is quite often played either in the opposition half or even the final quarter, then it's so frustrating for all concerned when 95% of the groundwork can be done, but that last part is somehow evading you and eluding you on a consistent basis simply because the person with that particular skill set is missing. And even if they have to break any budgetary constraints, insofar as it's not something wholly outlandish, then it's something that they should be looking at. And, you know, the acquisition of Carvalho for Hull City is quite telling insofar as I don't believe that Sunderland in the main have been a club over the last 18 months or so that are capable of going to elite clubs in the Premier League and getting some of the players that have had decent experience or exposure for them. You know, so Carvalho, it took me by surprise to an extent that they've managed to get him. But when Sunderland have went and got players on loan, it tends to be players who might be at the club level 3 within their position or level 4. So Sunderland really should be, especially when it's a season that will conclude with an international tournament. And given that modern football fashion is that so many teams now play with only one recognised centre forward, that means logically that there will be a significant number of forwards at clubs in the Premier League who aren't getting the game time or the minutes that they would feel they would be content with. And so they might be much more inclined to the idea of a loan move. And yes, if Sunderland have to make up the shortfall in terms of the wages or come to some sort of agreement, then it should be something certainly that's looked at. There's nothing really should be put to one side simply because there's reservations financially.
I mean, Kei Kamara is one of the names that's been mentioned in recent weeks from Bournemouth. And he's a Wales international, somebody that has got a proven track record of scoring in the Championship. I mean, is he a player that for you would fit the profile of what you would like to see. He's out of favour at Bournemouth at the minute.
Yeah.
Obviously, it doesn't have to be, you know, that player, but that's the sort of, you know, individual I think that they should be targeting.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Kiefer Moore, you know, who would have parallels in a sense with Ross Stewart insofar as physique, stature, ability to take it in, is that certainly with regards to what we've seen over the first 6 months of this season, there might have to be slight tweaks to how you're going to attack, particularly in the final third. Now, if it's Patrick Roberts on the right and Jack Clarke on the left, and you're going to have someone like Kiefer Moore playing, then of course you can use that physicality that he offers, getting the ball into feet and playing around him. But this is someone that scores a reasonable percentage of his goals aerially. And the delivery from wide would have to be much better than it has been. And part of the problem, I think, with playing two people on the wings that are playing on their opposite feet, so to speak, you know, Jack Clarke, is that Kiefer Moore would be of the old school insofar as wanting players to get to the byline and stand up crosses. And with the greatest will in the world, Jack Clarke has never shown that he can do that. Patrick Roberts seems very, very, very reluctant to go onto his right foot and do it. So there would be benefits in bringing in Kiefer Moore, undoubtedly, none more so than you highlighting that he scored goals in the Championship. I think he's cute enough and clever enough to play on the ground, but I still think that if you were wanting to maximise the benefits from him, then, you know, making sure that the deliveries are good and consistent, you know, would obviously be much more advantageous. You know, like Kiefer Moore's the type that would be crying out quite often for a Nicky Summerby, or, you know, somebody that can really put those deliveries into the box that make it quite easy for someone with his abilities to score. But if it's Kiefer Moore, listen, where Sunderland are at the moment, and if you told me this afternoon that Kiefer Moore had signed on loan, Sunderland are better straight away. So,
yeah, it speaks volumes. Lastly, obviously, it's Ipswich this weekend. I mean, what have you made of their approach? I know we've been, you know, full of praise for Sunderland last season, finishing in the playoffs. Ipswich look like one of the teams that could go one better and actually finish in automatic promotion. What have you made of their start? I mean, because from a personal point of view, I knew Kieran McKenna was a good coach, but even this season, they've taken me by surprise.
He himself has been a revelation, you know, from when he took over, and obviously I think they went on an extended unbeaten run. Not only that, he's been able to do it playing in a way that is very pleasing on the eye, but first and foremost is effective. Now, I think come October or November last year, there were people being a little bit inquisitive as to whether Ipswich were able to sustain it. I don't think they would have the same concerns about Leicester, and that in many regards has been validated. So, you know, it's been now some time for Championship clubs without a league fixture. Ipswich will be hoping to sort of refresh and get back to what they have been for the most part. That all started, of course, with a visit to the Stadium of Light back in August, where I think they took people by surprise and coming away with the victory. But then what happened subsequently showed that this was a team brimming with confidence. And, you know, as much as the wheels have come off ever so slightly recently, they still have that position in the automatic spots, I believe.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's going to be a very, very difficult game. You know, and Sunderland, the one benefit, I suppose, in what we seen last Saturday was that, you know, Sunderland were having to spend a lot of the game chasing the ball. And I think in playing Ipswich, there were periods where you have to do that also. Yeah. So, you know, if there's any benefits coming from the Newcastle fixture, it might be that, well, maybe we need to work a bit harder, because there will be periods where Ipswich have the ball, they're good in possession. So, but it's another game, and I'm sure by the time Saturday comes, you know, they'll be exclusively focused on the matter at hand.
Yeah, I mean, if they were to get 3 points again, you're starting to talk about the run that Sunderland are putting together then, aren't you? The teams that over the festive period, and then again that stands them on good foundations heading into what is another difficult run of games with Hull and then Middlesbrough.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly does, and you know, for Michael Beale, for the players, as much as a derby defeat will always hurt, and it will be brought up by people in various workplaces and social settings and family gatherings. If the season culminates in promotion, then you know that for me is the primary objective having been achieved, and the people at the club, you know, can put forward their own case that their decision has been vindicated. And of course, if they're promoted, then it has.
Yeah, spot on. Thank you very much for joining me this morning, Kieron. You've been great. As I said earlier, you know, We Are Sunderland, it's now live. Make sure you make the most of our launch offer, where it's £1 for just for 6 months of coverage. You get exclusive interviews, you get insight from former players like Kieron Brady. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll be back later in the week.